The reading I've chosen today is to give us a little sense of our history. The paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin said, "Nothing is intelligible outside of its history." In fact, you're not. If you got amnesia, you literally wouldn't know who you are. So a little bit of our history to see how our reproductive ethics formed is very helpful. In ancient times, the worry was not about too many people, but about too few. This led to legislation under the Roman Emperor Augustus that penalized bachelors and rewarded families for their fertility. Widowers and divorcees were expected to remarry within a month. Only those who were over 50 were allowed to remain unmarried. Remember that Augustus presided over a society with an average life expectancy of less than 25 years. It was a society where, as historian Peter Brown says, death fell savagely on the young. Only 4 out of every 100 men and fewer women lived beyond their 50th birthdays. As a species, we formed our reproductive habits in worlds that were, as St. John Chrysostom put it, grazed thin by death. That should have taught us quite a bit. It should have taught us not to be so dumb. Even Aristotle, over 2,000 years ago, saw the problem of overpopulation. And he said, if you overpopulate beyond the resources of the community, there'll be total chaos. The human community will disintegrate from overpopulation. He had a double solution for that: colonize, go somewhere else. That was nice in a time when there was always somewhere else to go. We're running out of that. His second solution was turn to homosexuality. And guess who commented on him in the 13th century? My old buddy Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas agreed with him that we cannot overpopulate. It is self-destructive. It will destroy a society. And Thomas even added, this should be guaranteed by the state. He didn't get into details of how the state would do it, but he saw it as that serious, that it should be guaranteed by the state. He demurred on the second solution of Aristotle, which was homosexuality. Thomas was not about to go there. But then when you look at us right now, we're on a planet that could hold, the way we consume and pollute, about 2.5 to 4 billion people. That's what it could. That's the carrying capacity. Well, we've already doubled that, and we're adding more and more by the millions. I mean, think of this thought. We have more, funny way to put it, we have more fertiles on Earth right now than there were people in 1950. All those young men out there with sperm that can leap over tall buildings in a single bound. And we don't know what they're going to do with that. So in spite of all of that, in spite of those figures, we still have people condemning contraception and abortion, when necessary, as a backup to contraception. And again, that question, how did we get so dumb? So let me try to answer that in the little time allotted to me. I'd say one of the first things is we have very stupid attitudes in our society toward sex. Think of the double meanings and mixed messages we give our children. Sex is dirty. Save it for someone you really love. I mean, it would seem that you would want to give it to someone you really hated. I can't stand you, let's have sex, that'll fix you. No, that's not too sensible. So you have to look and say, well, how did we get so confused? Well, the first reason is really not our fault. The problem with the human race is we are hornier than we need to be for the good of our species. As I say, that's not our fault. Carl Sagan said, natural selection favored the highly sexed, the highly sexually driven. Those who were not too impulsively sexual in their activities, obviously, faded out, and the highly sexed survived, and now they are us. That's us. So in that sense, you could say, well, it's not our fault that we have this irrationality. Someone said lust in us is like, having lust is like living chained to a maniac. That's a grim thought, but there's a bit of good sense in it. It's a tough impulse. There's another reason we are so dumb, and that's the Stoic philosophers. Around the time Christianity started, Stoic philosophy was the most popular philosophy probably in the history of the world because it just permeated everywhere. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, wrote as a Stoic. Epictetus, the slave, wrote. And that's sort of what happened. It was a philosophy that was extremely popular, and it was very useful. It was really, you know, when they talk about our right brain and our left brain is where all the impulses, emotions, dynamism, charging, it's very important. But it also is unruly. And the left brain is where reason dwells and order. And the Stoics were the champions of reason. And they decided that our real problem is our emotions, the right brain. Cicero, who wrote as a Stoic, said he called emotions, and you'll be able to translate the Latin, impedimenta, impediments. They get in the way. So the suppression of emotion was considered ideal. So how did these people, that was a good idea. It was civilizing. Roman law resulted from that kind of thinking, giving the left brain its due. So how did they handle sex, which is obviously full of these impedimenta, these emotions, these passions? They came up with this idea: the only rational use of sex is reproduction. They sewed that idea into Western culture. And because of that, contraception obviously makes sex irrational, abortion even more so, and of course same-sex marriage has no rationale at all. I often think there is nothing so powerful as a bad idea. And that idea really took off. And we bought the Stoic philosophies that appealed to the Christians. They even would refer back to Noster Seneca. Our Seneca said, well, he wasn't yours, guys. He was theirs. He was one of the... But we bought into that kind of Stoic restraint. So we blame the Stoics for part of our stupidity. But we also have to blame religion. All the world religions, I'll say a bit more about this, have both pro- and anti-choice views, even Christianity, even Catholicism. But they have some terribly negative attitudes toward human sexuality. And I think the biggest ogre in all of this was Augustine. Augustine had a lot of rambunctious sex in his youth, and then he picked up a weird Platonic kind of religion and set out to make sure that none of us would never, ever again have any sexual fun. And he was a major shaper of Western culture and certainly Christian culture. He concluded that sexual pleasure, because it was highly emotional, was wrong. It was sinful. Now, you know the Genesis story and creation and paradise and Adam and Eve as symbols of humanity, and we didn't behave well and got thrown out. All of that was a symbolic story. For a long time, until modern scholarship redeemed us again, they felt that there once was a paradise somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and even used to go looking for remnants of it. And in that paradise, everything was perfect. Everything, we were in perfect harmony with one another, in perfect harmony with the rest of nature. So Augustine believed that there was once a perfection state, but we got thrown out. We're now damaged goods. We're broken because we got thrown out of that perfection. So Augustine was asked by his people, well, if we were perfect then, and you said sexual pleasure is bad, was there sex in paradise? Well, Augustine hadn't heard of cloning, which he would have loved, but he said, well, yes, there had to be sex in paradise. And was the questions, sensible question came from the people, well, was there sexual pleasure? No, he said, absolutely not. And I thought, funny thing to call that paradise. But he said, no, there was not, we were damaged. Now you have to admire the common sense of the unlettered people who were hearing him. And they said, if there was sex in paradise, and yet there was no sexual pleasure, they asked this very practical question, how did the men get it up? And he had an answer for them. He said they willed it up. There was no need for Viagra in his view at all. Well, you'll be happy to hear that some of his listeners found that a little strange. So he had to go back to the drawing board and come up with some reasons. He said, we can, even in our broken state, thrown out of paradise, we can do tremendous things with our will. He said, I was at a gathering where there was a man who could move an ear just by sitting there willing it. He was at another party where a man could move 2 ears. You have to wonder what kind of parties this guy was into. But this guy could move 2 ears. So his thesis was, if in our broken state you have people who can move ears, surely there's someone who can pop a penis, certainly in paradise. Well, you'll be again pleased to hear that the people didn't quite buy that. Common sense prevailed over his extraordinary erudition. So poor Augustine went back to the drawing board and came back with flatulence. Yes, flatulence. And I quote his words here. Every now and then I read words from somebody and I think, gosh, I wish I had written those words. These are words I'm glad I never wrote. Augustine said some people that he had seen, again at these gatherings that he went to, who can produce at will odorless sounds from their breech, a kind of singing from the other end. That's not a good moment in Christian history and Christian thought. And it certainly shows that the roots of some of our thinking are a bit strange. Well, Augustine wasn't the only ogre in the Christian tradition. Albert the Great, he had the view that if you have too much sex, it will cause you to emit an odor from your body, and dogs will follow you as you go around. He also said it causes, too much sex causes baldness. What have I just admitted to this congregation? So the bottom line of that is, if you see some old bald guy with a bunch of dogs following him, you know what that rascal's been up to. Albert the Great also, again, this indicates that we didn't come from a very healthy tradition. Albert the Great also told the story of a monk who was filled with lust in spite of his vow of celibacy for a certain woman. And finally he achieved his desire and was able to spend the whole night with her. Albert reported that during that night he had sex with this woman 36 times. In the morning, he was dead. There is no report on whether he had a smile on his dead face or that. We have no information on that. But he had this terrible news. Because of sex is so damaging, it had shrunk his brain. They did an autopsy on him, and it had shrunk his brain to the size of a walnut. That's how terrible sexual activity is. But this was a long tradition. A 17th century Calvinist doctor said the same thing. If you have too much sex, your brain will shrink, he said, to the size of a pomegranate. So much so that if you shook your head, you'd be able to hear it rattling around in there. So if any of you want to shake your heads a little bit, we might learn something about you. However, it sort of brings to mind the old saying of Alexander Pope, the poet, the worst of madman is a saint gone mad. So if you have some bad ideas and you give it religious stimulus, it really takes off. The good side is, if you have good ideas, it can also really take off. But there is good news. There's good news in the tradition. Both Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, the two biggest saints maybe in the tradition, both of them held that the early fetus was not a person. And they held this idea of delayed, graduated animation. So if there's life, for example, anywhere there's life, they use the word soul. So if there's grass, the grass has a vegetative soul. A little squirrel goes by, that's life, but different kind, a higher level, that's an animal soul. And then you walk by, and you have a different soul, you have a spiritual soul. And both of them held this view that in the early pregnancy, the fetus, the early embryo fetus, had a vegetative soul. Only gradually did it acquire the level of an animal soul. And then they weren't sure when. Some say 2 months, some say 4 months, some say at quickening in the tradition. Only then is the brain sufficiently developed to receive a human soul. Prior to that, abortion, according to Augustine and Thomas, could not be murder. It could not be the killing of a person because there's no person there yet. Potential, but not real. There were people in the tradition like St. Antoninus, former Archbishop of Florence, the most famous theologian of his day. And St. Antoninus held and defended early abortions when necessary to save the life of the woman. And that was a big category in the medical conditions of his day. When all pregnancies were risky, they even used to try to recruit nuns to come in and say, why get married and get pregnant and die when you could live a long time without doing that? So Antoninus said that he was convinced that you could have an abortion, an early abortion, when it was necessary to save the life of the woman, which, as I say, could be an awful lot of them. So religions are, it's simply wrong when you say religions are all opposed to abortion. They're simply not. In my little book, Sacred Choices, The Right to Contraception and Abortion in 10 World Religions, I go through those world religions and show that they all have, alongside of a no-choice view, which they also have a pro-choice view in every one of them. And people like Antoninus defending abortion in certain conditions. I called that book Sacred Choices, and for that I have to give credit to my wife, Edie. I had the subtitle, The Right to Contraception and Abortion in 10 World Religions, but that's not a title. So Edie was showering one day. I said, Edie, I need a 2-word title. She knew what the book was about. And from the shower, she shouted, how about Sacred Choices? Choice for contraception and abortion, these are sacred choices. Nothing unholy about them, nothing sinful about them. Those are sacred choices. I think it was a great title. So many of my colleague friends who were writing books said, Edie's good at titles, that they were all asking me, put Edie in the shower and see if she can come up with something, but it led to a lot of dry skin problems and things like that with poor Edie. So let's get to the bottom line on this subject of abortion. And the bottom line is, very simply, the pregnant woman is the Supreme Court. Please don't turn her decisions over to male-dominated courts, male-dominated legislatures, or male-dominated religions. She, the pregnant woman, is the decider. Why turn that decision over to men? Men are dangerous. Let me make this statement, bold statement. The most dangerous animal on this planet, so try to think a little bit, what would that be, the most dangerous animal on this planet? The most dangerous animal on this planet is the human male between 14 and 45. If you hear of any killing going on in the Middle East, Africa, or Milwaukee, it will almost always be done by a male somewhere between 14 and 45. That's the most dangerous animal. Trusting men, be careful. The second most dangerous animal is the human male between 45 and 85. What do? Well, they stop running around killing. Instead, they take away food stamps from kids. They wreck the environment with their greed. And they think that political power comes out of the barrel of a gun, so they like to send young men and women out to use guns. And also, in very high numbers, old men, old white guys especially, support Donald Trump in everything that he does. Now, you want a little good news? You do not have to fear me. I'm 87, almost as good as a woman. So I end up with these final rules on abortion. Number one, 3 little rules. Let the pregnant woman decide. She is the Supreme Court. Number 2, trust her. And number 3, support her. That's it.